Today's text is one that will challenge our understanding of Jesus. He himself struggles in the text and I believe is bested by the woman that he encounters. So let's listen to the story and afterwards we'll unpack some dimensions of it. Now, from there Jesus rose and he went off to the Gentile territory of Tyre. And he was in a house and he didn't want anyone to know about him. He couldn't escape notice. Rather, a woman whose daughter was possessed by an unclean spirit heard about him. And she came and she fell at his feet. Well, the woman was a Greek, a syro-phonecian by birth. And she pleaded with Jesus to drive the demon from her daughter. Jesus said to her, let the children be fed first. It's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And she said to him, yes, sir. Even little dogs under the table get some of the precious children's crumbs. And Jesus said to her, for saying this, go. The demon has left your daughter. And she went to her house and found the little girl thrown on the bed, and the demon was gone. And going out from Tyre, Jesus went through Sidon, towards the Sea of Galilee, up through the 10 cities. And some people brought to him a man who was deaf and tongue-tied, and pleaded with him that he might lay his hands on him. And taking him off privately, Jesus put his fingers in his ears and was spittily touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he groaned and he said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were open. And the binding of his tongue was loosened, and he was talking articulately. And Jesus was ordering them to tell no one about this, but the more he ordered them, the more they insisted on proclaiming it. So that everyone who heard was astounded and said, who is this guy? He even makes the deaf hear and the tongue-tied talk? Ha! So we have really two stories laid side by side, both taking place in Gentile territory. Fairly rare for Jesus up to this point. In fact, one of the interesting things that are on each side of this story is Jesus feeds 5,000 people with bread in the desert, and that's in Israel's territory. And then just a bit later, he'll feed 4,000 people with bread, 4,000 Gentile people with bread in the desert. Two different stories, but are also very much the same, as this woman, in my opinion, invites Jesus to struggle with his sense of his own mission, how broadly his arms and his work are to extend. And I think that's key in this story is to figure out how to convey that tension and to understand this interchange. I've heard several ways that people process it. For a long time, people said, well, Jesus is testing the woman. And I have a hard time trafficking with that. It seems to me a cruel opportunity to seize to test people. I've had other people say, look, I've had to beg for something that my child needs, and I'm willing to be utterly humiliated if it'll get my child something in the end. That's what it means for me to be a mother. a woman told me. I had another person say to me that she saw coming out of the islands. She said that she saw this as the kind of interplay that takes place on the streets, where one people dishes out something to see if the other one can respond, and there's this back and forth. And the woman bests Jesus in this verbal jousting that they engage in. I personally think the woman catches Jesus off guard. He's exhausted and hears this word. And it surprises him and causes him to expand his understanding of where God is sending him. He's kind of, I want Jesus to be a little off balance in this. And it does change him. To me, to be truly human is that, to be challenged at the limitations of our own perspective and to be open to expanding them. If that's what happens, I find it really interesting that we know this story, because within the story at least, it's only Jesus and the woman who are in the room. And so that means one of the two of them had to share this story for it to get out. I love the idea of Jesus going back to his disciples and saying, all that stuff about just the lost children of Israel, well, I needed to expand that. And guess what? Now we need to expand that. So in a sense, in the second story, when Jesus pleads to God, looking up to heaven, that this man's ears and tongue be loosened, maybe he's also still struggling with this encounter with the woman, and he's asking also that his own heart be opened to those whom it naturally wants to close to. Two other things I want to mention in terms of storytelling. One technique I use in the first story is what I call like a rewind. So it would be lovely if we could see both the face of the woman and the face of Jesus when they're telling the story. My friend Richard Swanson works with troops of actors, so he has two faces doing it. And interestingly, if you check out the DVD that accompanies Provoking the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus says, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw to the dogs, the actor playing the woman slaps Jesus across the face. He tells me it wasn't something planned, it spontaneously came up. I want to capture something of that interchange, and yet I only get to show one face at a time, so I do something that I think of as kind of a rewind. So Jesus says to her, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And then I introduce her, and she, and pause, and during that time, I can give her response that had taken place simultaneously with Jesus's words. So, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And she said to him, yes, sir. A second thing I want to talk about in the next story is in the ancient Greek language, sound was meant to convey some of the meaning. And I seek to bring that principle into this story, not by replicating the Greek, but by my own translations, which in two places help us to see clearly what's going on in the text. And so when the man who was not able to speak has his tongue loosened, I like to show his new articulateness by the way I translate that phrase. And he was talking articulately. So that's some nice explosive consonants that allow him to talk articulately. And then I wanted a little bit of alliteration at the end to emphasize their wonder. This guy does everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the tongue-tied talk. So I hope this little interchange gives you some things to think about as you're preparing to tell the story and perhaps preach on it. Thank you.